Chapter 8. The Death of the First Man-Eater. A day or two after the departure of my allies, as I was leaving my boma soon after dawn on December 9th, I heard a Swahili running excitedly towards me, shouting, "Simba, Simba, lion, lion," and every now and again looking behind him as he ran. On questioning him, I found that the lions had tried to snatch a man from the camp by the river, but being foiled in this, had seized and killed one of the donkeys, and were at that moment busy devouring it not far off. Now was my chance. I rushed for the heavy rifle which Farquhar had kindly left with me for use in case an opportunity such as this should arise, and, led by the Swahili, I started most carefully to stalk the lions, who, I devoutly hoped, were confining their attention strictly to their meal. I was getting on splendidly, and could just make out the outline of one of them through the dense bush, when unfortunately my guide snapped a rotten branch. The wily beast heard the noise, growled his defiance, and disappeared in a moment into a patch of even thicker jungle close by. In desperation at the thought of his escaping me once again, I crept hurriedly back to the camp, summoned the available workmen, and told them to bring all the tom-toms, tin cans, and other noisy instruments of any kind that could be found. As quickly as possible, I posted them in a half-circle round the thicket, and gave the head jemadar instructions to start a simultaneous beating of the tom-toms and cans as soon as he judged that I had had time to get round to the other side. I then crept round by myself, and soon found a good position, and one which the lion was most likely to retreat past, as it was in the middle of a broad animal path leading straight from the place where he was concealed. I lay down behind a small ant-hill and waited expectantly. Very soon I heard a tremendous din being raised by the advancing line of coolies, and almost immediately, to my intense joy, out into the open path stepped a huge maneless lion. It was the first occasion during all these trying months upon which I had had a fair chance at one of these brutes, and my satisfaction at the prospect of bagging him was unbounded. Slowly he advanced along the path, stopping every few seconds to look round. I was only partially concealed from view, and if his attention had not been so fully occupied by the noise behind him, he must have observed me. As he was oblivious to my presence, however, I let him approach to within about 15 yards of me, and then covered him with my rifle. The moment I moved to do this, he caught sight of me, and seemed much astonished at my sudden appearance, for he stuck his forefeet into the ground, threw himself back on his haunches, and growled savagely. As I covered his brain with my rifle, I felt that at last I had him absolutely at my mercy, but never trust an untried weapon. I pulled the trigger, and to my horror heard the dull snap that tells of a misfire. Worse was to follow. I was so taken aback and disconcerted by this untoward accident that I entirely forgot to fire the left barrel, and lowered the rifle from my shoulder with the intention of reloading, if I should be given time. Fortunately for me, the lion was so distracted by the terrific din and uproar of the coolies behind him that instead of springing on me, as might have been expected, he bounded aside into the jungle again. By this time I had collected my wits, and just as he jumped, I let him have the left barrel. An answering angry growl told me that he had been hit, but nevertheless he succeeded once more in getting clear away, for although I tracked him for some little distance, I eventually lost his trail in a rocky patch of ground. Bitterly did I anathematize the hour in which I had relied on a borrowed weapon, and in my disappointment and vexation I abused owner, maker, and rifle with fine impartiality. On extracting the unexploded cartridge, I found that the needle had not struck home, the cap being only slightly dented, so that the whole fault did indeed lie with the rifle, which I later returned to Farquhar with polite compliments. Seriously, however, my continued ill luck was most exasperating, and the result was that the Indians were more than ever confirmed in their belief that the lions were really evil spirits, proof against mortal weapons. Certainly they did seem to bear charmed lives. After this dismal failure, there was, of course, nothing to do but to return to camp. Before doing so, however, I proceeded to view the dead donkey, which I found to have been only slightly devoured in the quarters. It is a curious fact that lions always begin at the tail of their prey, and eat upwards towards the head. As their meal had thus been interrupted evidently at the very beginning, I felt pretty sure that one or other of the brutes would return to the carcass at nightfall. Accordingly, as there was no tree of any kind close at hand, I had a staging erected some 10 feet away from the body. This machan was about 12 feet high and was composed of 4 poles stuck into the ground and inclined towards each other at the top, where a plank was lashed to serve as a seat. Further, as the nights were still pitch dark, I had the donkey's carcass secured by strong wires into a neighboring stump, so that the lions might not be able to drag it away before I could get a shot at them. At sundown, therefore, I took up my position on my airy perch, and much to the disgust of my gun-bearer, Mahina, I decided to go alone. I would gladly have taken him with me, indeed, but he had had a bad cough, and I was afraid lest he should make any involuntary noise or movement which might spoil all. Darkness fell almost immediately, and everything became extraordinarily still. The silence of an African jungle on a dark night needs to be experienced to be realized. It is most impressive, especially when one is absolutely alone and isolated from one's fellow creatures, as I was then. The solitude and stillness and the purpose of my vigil all had their effect on me, and from a condition of strained expectancy I gradually fell into a dreamy mood which harmonized well with my surroundings. Suddenly I was startled out of my reverie by the snapping of a twig, and straining my ears for a further sound, I fancied I could hear the rustling of a large body forcing its way through the bush. The man-eater, I thought to myself. Surely tonight my luck will change, and I shall bag one of the brutes. Profound silence again succeeded. I sat on my eyrie like a statue, every nerve tense with excitement. Very soon, however, all doubt as to the presence of the lion was dispelled. A deep, long-drawn sigh, a sure sign of hunger, came up from the bushes, and the rustling commenced again as he cautiously advanced. In a moment or two a sudden stop, followed by an angry growl, told me that my presence had been noticed, and I began to fear that disappointment awaited me once more. But no. Matters quickly took an unexpected turn. The hunter became the hunted, and instead of either making off or coming for the bait prepared for him, the lion began stealthily to stalk me. For about 2 hours he horrified me by slowly creeping round and round my crazy structure, gradually edging his way nearer and nearer. Every moment I expected him to rush it, and the staging had not been constructed with an eye to such a possibility. If one of the rather flimsy poles should break, or the lion should spring the 12 feet which separated me from the ground, the thought was scarcely a pleasant one. I began to feel distinctly creepy, and heartily repented my folly in having placed myself in such a dangerous position. I kept perfectly still, however, hardly daring even to blink my eyes, but the long-continued strain was telling on my nerves, and my feelings may be better imagined than described, when about midnight suddenly something came flop and struck me on the back of the head. For a moment I was so terrified that I nearly fell off the plank, as I thought that the lion had sprung on me from behind. Regaining my senses in a second or two, I realized that I had been hit by nothing more formidable than an owl, which had doubtless mistaken me for the branch of a tree. Not a very alarming thing to happen in ordinary circumstances, I admit, but coming at the time it did, it almost paralyzed me. The involuntary start which I could not help giving was immediately answered by a sinister growl from below. After this I again kept as still as I could, though absolutely trembling with excitement, and in a short while I heard the lion begin to creep stealthily towards me. I could barely make out his form as he crouched among the whitish undergrowth, but I saw enough for my purpose, and before he could come any nearer, I took careful aim and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was at once followed by a most terrific roar, and then I could hear him leaping about in all directions. I was no longer able to see him, however, as his first bound had taken him into the thick bush. But to make assurance doubly sure, I kept blazing away in the direction in which I heard him plunging about. At length came a series of mighty groans, gradually subsiding into deep sighs, and finally ceasing altogether. I felt convinced that one of the devils, who had so long harried us, would trouble us no more. As soon as I ceased firing, a tumult of inquiring voices was borne across the dark jungle from the men in the camp about a quarter of a mile away. I shouted back that I was safe and sound, and that one of the lions was dead, whereupon such a mighty cheer went up from all the camps as must have astonished the denizens of the jungle for miles around. Shortly I saw scores of lights twinkling through the bushes. Every man in camp turned out, with tom-toms beating and horns blowing, came running to the scene. They surrounded my eyrie, and to my amazement prostrated themselves on the ground before me, saluting me with cries of Mabarak, Mabarak, which I believe means Blessed One or Savior. All the same, I refused to allow any search to be made that night for the body of the lion, in case his companion might be close by. Besides, it was possible that he might still be alive, capable of making a last spring. Accordingly, we all returned in triumph to the camp, where great rejoicings were kept up for the remainder of the night, the Swahili and other African natives celebrating the occasion by an especially wild and savage dance. For my part, I anxiously awaited the dawn, and even before it was thoroughly light, I was on my way to the eventful spot, as I could not completely persuade myself that even yet the devil might not have eluded me in some uncanny and mysterious way. Happily, my fears proved groundless, and I was relieved to find that my luck, after playing me so many exasperating tricks, had really turned at last. I had scarcely traced the blood for more than a few paces when, on rounding a bush, I was startled to see a huge lion right in front of me, seemingly alive and crouching for a spring. On looking closer, however, I satisfied myself that he was really and truly stone dead, whereupon my followers crowded round, laughed and danced and shouted with joy like children, and bore me in triumph shoulder high round the dead body. These Thanksgiving ceremonies being over, I examined the body and found that 2 bullets had taken effect, one close behind the left shoulder, evidently penetrating the heart, and the other in the off hind leg. The prize was indeed one to be proud of. His length from tip to nose to tip of tail was 9 feet 8 inches. He stood 3 feet 9 inches high, and it took 8 men to carry him back to camp. The only blemish was that the skin was much scored by the boma thorns through which he had so often forced his way in carrying off his victims. The news of the death of one of the notorious man-eaters soon spread far and wide over the country. Telegrams of congratulation came pouring in, and scores of people flocked up from down the railway to see the skin for themselves. Chapter 9. The Death of the Second Man-Eater. It must not be imagined that with the death of this lion our troubles at Tsavo were at an end. His companion was still at large, and very soon began to make us unpleasantly aware of the fact. Only a few nights elapsed before he made an attempt to get at the permanent way inspector, climbing up the steps of his bungalow and prowling around the veranda. The inspector, hearing the noise and thinking it was a drunken coolie, shouted angrily, "Go away!" But fortunately for him, he did not attempt to come out or to open the door. Thus disappointed in his attempt to obtain a meal of human flesh, the lion seized a couple of the inspector's goats and devoured them there and then. On hearing of this occurrence, I determined to sit up the next night near the inspector's bungalow. Fortunately, there was a vacant iron shanty close at hand, with a convenient loophole in it for firing from, and outside this I placed 3 full-grown goats as bait, tying them to a half length of rail, weighing about 250 pounds. The night passed uneventfully until just before daybreak, when at last the lion turned up, pounced on one of the goats, and made off with it, at the same time dragging away the others, rail and all. I fired several shots in his direction, but it was pitch dark and quite impossible to see anything, so I only succeeded in hitting one of the goats. I often longed for a flashlight on such occasions. Next morning I started off in pursuit and was joined by some others from the camp. I found that the trail of the goats and rail was easily followed, and we soon came up, about a quarter of a mile away, to where the lion was still busy at his meal. He was concealed in some thick bush and growled angrily on hearing our approach. Finally, as we got closer, he suddenly made a charge, rushing through the bushes at a great pace. In an instant, every man of the party scrambled hastily up the nearest tree, with the exception of one of my assistants, Mr. Winkler, who stood steadily by me throughout. The brute, however, did not press his charge home, and on throwing stones into the bushes where we had last seen him, we guessed by the silence that he had slunk off. We therefore advanced cautiously, and on getting up to the place discovered that he had indeed escaped us, leaving 2 of the goats scarcely touched. Thinking that in all probability the lion would return as usual to finish his meal, I had a very strong scaffolding put up a few feet away from the dead goats, and took up my position on it before dark. On this occasion I brought my gun-bearer, Mahina, to take a turn at watching, as I was by this time worn out for want of sleep, having spent so many nights on the lookout. I was just dozing off comfortably when suddenly I felt my arm seized, and on looking up saw Mahina pointing in the direction of the goats. "Share, lion," was all he whispered. I grasped my double smooth-bore, which I had charged with a slug, and waited patiently. In a few moments I was rewarded, for as I watched the spot where I expected the lion to appear, there was a rustling among the bushes, and I saw him stealthily emerge into the open and pass almost directly beneath us. I fired both barrels practically together into his shoulder, and to my joy could see him go down under the force of the blow. Quickly I reached for the magazine rifle, but before I could use it he was out of sight among the bushes, and I had to fire after him quite at random. Nevertheless, I was confident of getting him in the morning, and accordingly set out as soon as it was light. For over a mile there was no difficulty in following the blood trail. As he had rested several times, I felt sure that he had been badly wounded. In the end, however, my hunt proved fruitless, for after a time the traces of blood ceased, and the surface of the ground became rocky, so that I was no longer able to follow the spoor. About this time, Sir Guilford Molesworth, KCIE, late consulting engineer to the Government of India for state railways, passed through Sava on a tour of inspection on behalf of the Foreign Office. After examining the bridge and other works and expressing his satisfaction, he took a number of photographs, one or two of which he has kindly allowed me to reproduce in this book. He thoroughly sympathized with all of us in the trials we had endured from the man-eaters, and was delighted that one at least was dead. When he asked me if I expected to get the second lion soon, I remember his half-doubting smile as I rather too confidently asserted that I hoped to bag him also in the course of a few days. As it happened, there was no sign of our enemy for about 10 days after this, and we began to hope that he had died of his wounds in the bush. All the same, we took every precaution at night, and it was fortunate that we did so, as otherwise at least one more victim would have been added to the list. For on the night of December 27th, I was suddenly aroused by terrified shouts from my trolley men, who slept in a tree close to outside my boma, to the effect that a lion was trying to get at them. It would have been madness to have gone out, as the moon was hidden by dense clouds, and it was absolutely impossible to see anything more than a yard in front of one. So all I could do was to fire off a few rounds just to frighten the brute away. This apparently had the desired effect, for the men were not further molested that night, but the man-eater had evidently prowled about for some time, and we found in the morning that he had gone right into every one of their tents, and round the tree was a regular ring of his footmarks. The following evening I took up my position in this same tree in the hope that he would make another attempt. The night began badly, as, while climbing up to my perch, I very nearly put my hand on a venomous snake, which was lying coiled around one of the branches. As may be imagined, I came down again very quickly, but one of my men managed to dispatch it with the long pole. Fortunately, the night was clear and cloudless, and the moon made everything almost as bright as day. I kept watch until about 2 a.m., when I roused Mahina to take his turn. For about an hour I slept peacefully with my back to the tree, then woke suddenly with an uncanny feeling that something was wrong. Mahina, however, was on the alert and had seen nothing, and although I looked carefully around us on all sides, I too could discover nothing unusual. Only half satisfied, I was about to lie back again, when I fancied I saw something move a little way off from the low bushes. On gazing intently at the spot for a few seconds, I found I was not mistaken. He was the man-eater, cautiously stalking us. The ground was fairly open round our tree, with only a small bush every here and there, and from our position it was a most fascinating sight to watch this great brute stealing stealthily around us, taking advantage of every bit of cover as he came. His skill showed that he was an old hand at the terrible game of man-hunting, so I determined to run no undue risk of losing him this time. I accordingly waited until he got quite close, about 20 yards away, and then fired my .30-30 at his chest. I heard the bullet strike him, but unfortunately it had no knockdown effect, for with a fierce growl he turned and made off with a great long bounds. Before he disappeared from sight, however, I managed to have 3 more shots at him from the magazine rifle, and another growl told me that the last of these had also taken effect. Daylight with impatience, and at the first glimmer of dawn we set out to hunt him down. I took a native tracker with me so that I was free to keep a good lookout, while Mahina followed immediately behind with a Martini carbine. Splashes of blood being plentiful, we were able to get along quickly, and we had not proceeded more than a quarter of a mile through the jungle when suddenly a fierce warning growl was heard right in front of us. Looking cautiously through the bushes, I could see the man-eater glaring out in our direction and showing his tusks in an angry snarl. I at once took careful aim and fired. Instantly he sprang out and made a most determined charge down on us. I fired again and knocked him over, but in a second he was up once more and coming for me as fast as he could in his crippled condition. A third shot had no apparent effect, so I put out my hand for the Martini, hoping to stop him with it. To my dismay, however, it was not there. The terror of the sudden charge had proved too much for the Mahina, and both he and the carbine were by this time well on their way up a tree. In the circumstances there was nothing to do but follow suit, which I did without loss of time, and but for the fact that one of my shots had broken a hind leg, the brute would most certainly have had me. Even as it was, I had barely time to swing myself up and out of his reach before he arrived at the foot of the tree. When the lion found he was too late, he started to limp back to the thicket, but by this time I had seized the carbine from Mahina, and the first shot I fired from it seemed to give him his quietus, for he fell over and lay motionless. Rather foolishly, I at once scrambled down from the tree and walked up towards him. To my surprise and no little alarm, he jumped up and attempted another charge. This time, however, a martini bullet in the chest and another in the head finished him for good and all. He dropped in his tracks not 5 yards away from me and died gamely, biting savagely at a branch which had fallen to the ground. By this time, all the workmen in camp, attracted by the sound of the firing, had arrived on the scene, and so great was their resentment against the brute who had killed such numbers of their comrades that it was only with the greatest difficulty that I could restrain them from tearing the dead body to pieces. Eventually, amid the wild rejoicings of the natives and coolies, I had the lion carried to my boma, which was close at hand. On examination, we found no less than 6 bullet holes in the body, and embedded only a little way in the flesh of the back was the slug which I had fired into him from the scaffolding about 10 days previously. He measured 9 feet 6 inches from tip of nose to tip of tail, and stood 3 feet 11.5 inches height. But, as in the case of his companion, the skin was disfigured by being deeply scored all over by the boma thorns. The news of the death of the second devil soon spread far and wide over the country, and natives actually traveled from up and down the line to have a look at my trophies and at the devil killer, as they called me. Best of all, the coolies who had absconded came flocking back to Tsavo, and much to my relief, work was resumed, and we were never again troubled by man-eaters. It was amusing indeed to notice the change which took place in the attitude of the workmen towards me after I had killed the 2 lions. Instead of wishing to murder me as they had once did, they could not now do enough for me, and as a token of their gratitude they presented me with a beautiful silver bowl, as well as with a long poem written in Hindustani describing all our trials and my ultimate victory. As the poem relates our troubles in somewhat quaint and biblical language, I have given a translation of it in the appendix. The bowl I shall always consider my most highly prized and hardest won trophy. The inscription on it reads as follows: Sir, we, your overseer, timekeepers, mistaris, and workmen, present you with this bowl as a token of our gratitude to you for your bravery in killing 2 man-eating lions at great risk to your own life, thereby saving us from the fate of being devoured by these terrible monsters who nightly broke into our tents and took our fellow workers from our side. In presenting you with this bowl, we all add our prayers for your long life, happiness, and prosperity. We shall ever remain, sir, your grateful servants. Babu Purushottam Herji Permar, Overseer and Clerk of Works, on behalf of your workmen, dated at Tsavo, January 30th, 1899. Before I leave the subject of the man-eaters of Tsavo, it may be of interest to mention that these 2 lions possess the distinction, probably unique among wild animals, of having been specifically referred to in the House of Lords by the Prime Minister of the day. Speaking of the difficulties which had been encountered in the construction of the Uganda Railway, the late Lord Salisbury said, quote, "The whole of the works were put to a stop for 3 weeks because a party of man-eating lions appeared in the locality and conceived a most unfortunate taste for our porters. At last the laborers entirely declined to go on, unless they were guarded by an iron entrenchment. Of course it is difficult to work a railway under these conditions, and until we found an enthusiastic sportsman to get rid of these lions, our enterprise was seriously hindered." Unquote. Also, the Spectator of March 3rd, 1900, had an article entitled "The Lions That Stopped the Railway," from which the following extracts are taken. Quote, "The parallel to the story of the lions which stopped the rebuilding of Samaria must occur to everyone, and if the Samaritans had quarter as good cause for their fears as had the railway coolies, their wish to propitiate the local deities is easily understood. If the whole body of lion anecdote from the days of the Assyrian kings to the last year of the 19th century were collated and brought together, it would not equal in tragedy or atrocity, in savageness or in sheer insolent contempt for man, armed or unarmed, white or black, the story of these 2 beasts. To what a distance the whole story carries us back, and how impossible it becomes to account for the survival of primitive man against this kind of foe. For fire, which has hitherto been regarded as his main safeguard against the carnivora, these cared nothing. It is curious that the Tsavo lions were not killed by poison, for strychnine is easily used, and with effect. I may mention that poison was tried, but without effect. The poisoned carcasses of transport animals which had died from the bite of the tsetse fly were placed in likely spots, but the wily man-eaters would not touch them, and much preferred live men to dead donkeys. Poison may have been used early in the history of man, for its powers are employed with strange skill by the men in the tropical forests, both in America and West Central Africa. But there is no evidence that the old inhabitants of Europe, or of Assyria or Asia Minor, ever killed lions or wolves by these means. They looked to the king or chief or some champion to kill these monsters for them. It was not the sport, but the duty of kings, and it was in itself a title to be ruler of men. Theseus, who cleared the roads of beasts and robbers, Hercules, the lion killer, St. George, the dragon slayer, and all the rest of their class owed to this their everlasting fame. From the story of the Tsavo River, we can appreciate their services to man, even at this distance of time. When the jungle twinkled with hundreds of lamps, as the shout went on from camp to camp that the first lion was dead, as the hurrying crowds fell prostrate in the midnight forest, laying their heads on his feet, and the Africans danced savage and ceremonial dances of thanksgiving, Mr. Patterson must have realized in no common way what it was to have been a hero and deliverer in the days when man was not yet undisputed lord of creation, and might pass at any moment under the savage dominion of the beasts." Unquote. Well had the two man-eaters earned all this fame. They had devoured between them no less than 28 Indian coolies, in addition to scores of unfortunate African natives, of whom no official record was kept. Chapter 10. The completion of the Tsavo Bridge. When all the excitement had died down and there was no longer any dread of the man-eaters, work went on briskly, and the bridge over the Sava rapidly near completion. As the piers and abutments progressed in height, the question of how to lift the large stones into their positions had to be solved. We possessed no cranes for this purpose, so I set to work and improved a shears made of a couple of 30-foot rails. These were bolted together at the top, while the other ends were fixed at a distance of about 10 feet apart in a large block of wood. This contrivance acted capitally, and by manipulation of ropes and pulleys the heavy stones were swung into position quickly and without difficulty, so that in a very short time the masonry of the bridge was completed. The next business was to span the 60-foot distance between the piers with iron girders. As I had neither winches nor sufficient blocks and tackle to haul these over into position, I was driven to erect temporary piers in the middle of each span, built up crib shape of wooden sleepers. Great wooden beams were stretched across from the stone piers to these cribs, inlaid with rails, and the girder was run over its exact place, while still on the trucks in which it had been brought up from the coast. It was next jacked up from the trucks, which were hauled away empty, and the temporary bridge was dismantled, and the girder finally lowered gently into position. When the last girder was thus successfully placed, no time was lost in linking up the permanent way, and very soon I had the satisfaction of seeing the first train cross the finished work. Curiously enough, only a day or so after the bridge had been completed and the intermediate cribs cleared away, a tremendous rainstorm broke over the country. The river started to rise rapidly, soon flooding its banks and becoming a raging, murky torrent, tearing up trees by the roots and whirling them along like straws. Steadily higher and higher rose the flood, and standing on my bridge, I watched expectantly for the two temporary trolley bridges, which, it will be remembered, we had built across the stream in order to bring stone and sand to the main work, to give way before the ever-rising volume of water. Nor had I long to wait, for soon I caught sight of a solid mass of palm stems and railway sleepers sweeping with almost irresistible force round the bend of the river some distance above the bridge. This I knew was the debris of the trolley crossing furthest up the river, and on it came, and with it an additional bank of stormy-looking water. I held my breath for the space of a moment as it actually leapt at the second frail structure. There was a dull thud and a rending and riving of timbers, and then the flood rolled on towards me, leaving not a vestige of the two bridges behind it. The impact, indeed, was so great that the rails were twisted round the broken tree trunks as if they had been so much ordinary wire. The double tier of wreckage now swept forward and hurled itself with a sullen plunge against the cutwaters of my stone piers. The shock was great, but to my immense satisfaction, the bridge took it without a tremor, and I saw the remnant of the temporary crossing swirl through the great spans and quickly disappear on its journey to the ocean. I confessed that I witnessed the whole occurrence with a thrill of pride. We were never long without excitement of some kind or another at Tsavo. When the camp was not being attacked by man-eating lions, it was visited by leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, wild cats, and other inhabitants of the jungle around us. These animals did a great deal of damage to the herds of sheep and goats which were kept to supply the commissariat, and there was always great rejoicing when a capture was made in one of the many traps that were laid for them. Leopards especially are most destructive, often killing for pleasure and not for food, and I have always harbored animosity towards them since the night when one wantonly destroyed a whole herd of mine. I happened at the time to have a flock of about 30 sheep and goats, which I kept for food and for milk, and which were secured at sundown in a grass hut at one corner of my boma. One particularly dark night we were startled by a tremendous commotion in the shed, but as this was before the man-eaters were killed and no one dared stir out to investigate the cause of the disturbance, I naturally thought that the intruder was one of the demons, but all I could do was to fire several shots in the direction of the hut, hoping to frighten him away. In spite of these, however, it was some time before the noise died down and everything became still again. As soon as it was dawn, I went to the shed to see what had happened, and there, to my intense anger, I found every one of my sheep and goats lying stretched dead on the ground with its throat bitten through. A hole had been made through the frail wall of the shed, and I saw from this and from the tracks all around that the author of the wholesale slaughter had been a leopard. He had not eaten one of the flock, but had killed them all out of pure love of destruction. I hoped that he would return the next night to make a meal, and should he do so, I determined to have my revenge. I accordingly left the carcasses exactly as they lay, and having a very powerful steel trap, like an enormous rat trap, and quite strong enough to hold a leopard if he should put his foot in it, I placed this in the opening into the shed, and secured it by a stout chain to a long stake driven into the ground outside. Darkness found everyone in my boma on the alert and listening anxiously to hear the noise the leopard would make the moment he was caught in the trap. Nor were we disappointed, for about midnight we heard the click of the powerful spring, followed immediately by frantic roaring and plunging. I had been sitting all evening with my rifle by my side and a lantern lighted, so I immediately rushed out, followed by the Chowkidar watchman carrying the lamp. As we approached the shed, the leopard made a frantic spring in our direction as far as the chain would allow him, and this so frightened the Chowkidar that he fled in terror, leaving me in utter darkness. The night was as black as it had been the previous one, and I could see absolutely nothing. But I knew the general direction in which to fire, and accordingly emptied my magazine at the beast. As far as I could make out, he kept dodging in and out through the broken wall of the goat house, but in a short time my shots evidently told, as the struggle ceased and all was still. I called out that he was dead, and at once everyone in the boma turned out, bringing all the lanterns in place. With the others came my Indian overseer, who shouted that he too wanted revenge, as some of the goats had belonged to him. Whereupon he leveled his revolver at the dead leopard, and shutting his eyes tightly, fired 4 shots in rapid succession. Naturally not one of these touched the beast, but they caused considerable consternation amongst the onlookers, who scattered rapidly right to left. Next morning a party of starving Wakamba happened to be passing just as I was about to skin the leopard, and asked by means of signs to be allowed to do the job for me, and then to take the meat. I of course assented to this proposal, and in a very few minutes the skin had been neatly taken off, and the famishing natives began a ravenous meal on the raw flesh. Wild dogs are also very destructive, and often cause great losses among our sheep and goats. Many a night I have listened to these animals hunting and harrying some poor creature of the wilds around my camp. They never relinquish a chase, and will attack anything, man or beast, when really driven by hunger. I was at Tsavo station one day, unfortunately without my rifle, when one of these dogs came up and stood within about 30 yards of me. He was a fine-looking beast, bigger than a collie, with jet black hair and white-tipped bushy tail. I was very sorry that I had not brought my rifle, as I badly wanted a specimen and never had another chance of obtaining one.